research I've been conducting with Yue Chan, also at UBC, looking at gender, parenthood, and the labor market in the context of job loss. So much of the talk is going to focus on covering pre-COVID outcomes. And this is from a paper we're in the final stages of revising for resubmission to Social Forces. But if I don't mess up the timing and take too long with that, I'll also discuss some findings from work that's forthcoming in Gender and Society this week in their special COVID-19 symposium that discusses job loss over the pandemic. And of course, some more recent extensions of that work that I'm just working on now and actually just kind of deciding whether it's worth going any further with. So I'll be interested in your questions and thoughts and comments about that for sure. So job loss, very timely topic, of course, in the pandemic. Losing one's job is never easy, with potentially harmful effects on mental health, economic security, and family functioning. Understanding the implications of job loss at the intersection of gender and parenthood is of increasing importance in contemporary labor markets, even before the pandemic hit us. As employers have sought to reduce obligations to their workers and to offload risks, an increasing share of the workforce labors under insecure arrangements. And of course, more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has massively disrupted economies and led to widespread job loss. No, somehow it doesn't want to, there we go. So job loss can occur for a number of reasons, including dissatisfaction with worker performance when a worker is fired, firm closures, or also business downturns or organizational restructuring, labor disputes, and the end of temporary or seasonal work. Firings clearly involve employer discretion, but so too can layoffs in downturns or restructuring as employers decide which jobs and employees to terminate. And there are several reasons to think that parental status might shape the risk of job loss, especially where employer discretion is involved. First of all, parenthood may interfere with job performance. Sick children, unstable care arrangements, or just the need to be available to care on evenings and weekends can interfere with work obligations. And this can affect any parent, but given women's disproportionate responsibility for caregiving, mothers especially. Second, although this is not allowed in Canada, employers may discriminate against mothers, making biased assumptions about work commitment and competence or the potential for future work-family interference. And we know that such biases can matter at the hiring stage from experimental work, and it's possible that they also impact assessments of mothers' performance on the job as well, putting them at greater risk of layoffs and firings. Consistent with this, Christine Williams, in a recent article published last year, for example, finds that professionals in a downsizing American oil and gas company perceived mothers with young children to have been disproportionately affected. Fathers of young children, however, were perceived as especially deserving of keeping their jobs as presumed family breadwinners and hence favored, highlighting the way that paternalistic attitudes may also foster discrimination. Now, while such attitudes protect fathers, they may also reflect beliefs that mothers' earnings are less important and that they may in fact be better off at home. Consistent with this, data from 2012 show that while most Canadians disagree that a young child suffers if their mother works, a sizable minority view this as problematic, still almost a third. And here, both of these are just data from the 2012 ISSP Family and Changing Gender Roles survey. We also see that while most Canadians saw full-time employment as best for mothers of school-aged children, the majority believe that it's best for mothers of younger children to work part-time at most or stay at home. And of course, mothers' greater representation in part-time jobs may make assumptions about caregiver and breadwinner roles especially salient to employers. And in the sample, the data that I'm going to talk about here for this first paper, about a quarter of mothers worked part-time versus 15% of childless women. Working part-time or flexible work arrangements may also contribute to marginalization, increasing the risk that workers are seen as expendable. As Caleb demonstrates in her study of managerial downsizing, position-based downsizing, so this is where you're choosing which positions to downsize rather than which people, while neutral on the surface, harms groups when layoff criteria map to institutionalized patterns of segregation that work to those groups' disadvantage. As one oil and gas professional noted when describing those layoffs, anyone who is working part-time was hard hit, and it was mostly mothers who were working part-time. Now, the dynamics outlined thus far all presume some element of employer discretion in deciding whether to dismiss or lay off particular workers. But even absent such discretion, parents may be more vulnerable if it's more difficult for them to leave firms before job loss occurs. And this is the metaphor of leaving the sinking ship before it actually goes down. As Farber demonstrates, workers who anticipate job loss often preemptively quit, but parents may respond less effectively to signals that their employer is in trouble or dissatisfied with their performance. Concern with disrupting children's schooling, care arrangements, and friendship networks may limit the geographic scope of job searches in the face of prospective downsizing or employer failure, especially for mothers of young children. Parents, mothers in particular, may also have more limited time to look for new jobs given caregiving responsibilities. And if parents face greater job search constraints, they're more likely overrepresented among workers employed by firms at risk of layoffs or closures, increasing the risk of job loss potentially. So to look at this, we look at data from the Workplace and Employee Survey in Canada. This is a mandatory linked employer-employee survey fielded by Statistics Canada from 1999 to 2005. So it's a little bit older now. Employees were followed for 2 years, and the employer sample was longitudinal, with the sample refreshed every second year. The target population of the West is all Canadian establishments with paid employees, with a few minor exceptions. So it doesn't include like farm workers or people who are in fishing or private religious organizations, sort of quite fairly minor restrictions there. And so the data are thus largely representative of Canadian employers and workers. The mandatory nature of the survey ensures a high response rate in excess of 80% for both individuals and employers. And our analytic sample that we're looking at are folks who were sort of prime age workers. They were 25 to 54 in the first wave. And that gives us about 20,000 individuals, 20,529 individuals in 5,800 establishments. And we really need that big of a sample, in part because job loss is, in any given time point, a relatively rare occurrence, at least prior to the pandemic. So you need to have quite a large sample to start with to be able to really sort of track the consequences of it. So we also, I should say, include those who were, well, I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so the dependent variables here. So we start off with looking at job loss, and here we're capturing sort of everybody whose job ended as opposed to them leaving their job, versus, and also those who are still with their employers, obviously. And we exclude those who had a temporary job loss. So they might have been laid off temporarily, but were back at their employer for the next wave. So this is permanent job losses of various types. And we also, in some of our analysis, restrict our focus a little bit further to job losses that we define as being more likely to have involved some element of discretion. And this is where you have either a firing or a layoff that's due to restructuring. So it's not that the employer has closed and everybody loses their job. It's that there's a restructuring and some workers are laid off and others are not. So we call that discretionary job loss. So the non-discretionary job loss then includes where the establishment is moved or closed, where the job ended because it was a seasonal or a labor, it was seasonal, whether it's a labor dispute or some kind of end of temporary contract. For independent variables, we look at parental status, of course, and we look at folks who had a dependent child, 18 years or younger, as of the second wave. So we include folks who are pregnant at the first wave because we think that pregnancy is a highly visible status, and that could trigger, we know from discrimination studies that can trigger job loss as well. And we also distinguish further between parents who had kids under 6 and those who had all children whose were 6 or older, with the idea that there might be sort of more demands on you when your child is under 6 and more likely to be experiencing that clash between work and caregiving obligations when your child is not at the age where they're typically in full-time school. So that's why the 6-year-old cut off in Canada. And we have a binary measure of male or female for gender, which is all that this older survey provides us. We control in all our analysis for experience, so years of full-time, full-year experience, for tenure, that is seniority with the employer, education in very fine-grained categories in this survey, age, marital status, race or ethnicity, immigrant status, total months unemployed in the previous 5 years. So that gives us a bit of an indicator of, there might be some more stable personal characteristics or occupational characteristics that might make you at higher risk of job loss generally, occupation, whether your job is unionized, and industry and year. All right. So to recap, there's a variety of reasons to think that mothers will be more vulnerable to job loss. And to the extent that fathers take on caregiving responsibilities, they may experience similar disadvantages. More traditional work-family arrangements that privilege paid employment over caregiving for fathers, on the other hand, should shelter them. Moreover, irrespective of fathers' actual caregiving and employment arrangements, paternalistic concerns with family well-being may cause employers to favor fathers as presumed family breadwinners. So what do we see? We'll start here with the overall probability of job loss, all else equal. So remember, we're looking at models that include these controls. Now, these are marginal estimates of predicted probabilities of job loss, so that, you know, folks who were observed in the first wave have lost their job when we look at them in the second wave. And we look at this from a logistic regression model. Those little numbers on the side here are telling us something about significance. So estimates that share a letter are not significantly different at the 0.05 level. So if we look at these top bars here, these are our bars for women, the lighter blue, we see that they all share, well, in fact, they share both letters, showing that although it looks like mothers of older children and younger children have a little bit higher risk of job loss than childless women, this is not a statistically significant difference. Now, when we look at men, we do see that fathers of older children have have the same statistically risk of job loss as childless men, so they're not being advantaged. But fathers of younger children have a lower risk of job loss, not lower than women. Interestingly, women typically have lower, you know, in non-pandemic times, lower risk of job loss in this data, even with the controls. But fathers of younger children at least, do seem to be favored over fathers of older children and childless men. And we also see that, as I alluded to, there's no difference between men and women of a given parental status here. If we look at those numbers, so mothers of older children are not significantly different from fathers. Mothers of younger children, again, it's a higher risk of job loss, but it's not statistically so. So the real key contrast that we're seeing here is these two bars: the fathers of younger children versus childless men. Now, when we look at discretionary job loss, so just those job losses that are firings or layoffs due to restructuring, we see the same general pattern. Most of the job losses are of this kind, not of the other types of job losses. But now we see that that fathers of younger children are only different from childless men. So they're no longer different from the fathers of older children there. We lose a little bit of precision in our estimate. So we lose that difference that's significant, but the point estimates are very similar. So we next look at the consequences of job loss. Now, why might gender and parental status matter here? So prior research has shown that parents are less likely to search for new jobs that require geographic moves, which could limit employment, increasing the risk of subsequent unemployment or relegation to new jobs of poorer quality. Basically, they can't cast quite as wide a net as folks who are childless, who might have more freedom to be able to just pick up and move and not worry about, you know, disrupting their kids' care arrangements and friendship networks and all the rest. Similarly, desires and needs for particular kinds of work arrangements amenable to caregiving responsibilities, such as part-time work, flexible hours, or avoiding overtime, can constrain job searches. As Child points out, potential sources of job referrals may also assume certain jobs are less suitable from others, limiting their access to opportunities. And indeed, Huffman and Torres found that unemployed job seekers with young children received lower quality job leads. Now, they didn't distinguish between mothers and fathers in their research there, but we think that that's probably more pronounced for mothers. The need to provide or pay for childcare for young children and the difficulty of sustaining this cost, which is relatively high in Canada after job loss, can also constrain mothers' ability to search for new jobs. Now, as traditional masculine models erode, caregiving constraints may not be limited to mothers, but gender divisions of labor have shifted more slowly than cultural attitudes. And indeed, Rao finds that middle-class unemployed men's time and space for job searching were prioritized in their families, whereas women were more likely to fit job searching around other responsibilities. So we expect caregiving constraints to impact mothers more than fathers. Now, traditionally, of course, breadwinning has been a key marker of good fatherhood, and qualitative research suggests that families, friends, neighbors, as well as men themselves are highly invested in fathers' reemployment in family-sustaining jobs. But at the same time, we might think that faster reemployment, the sort of push to make sure that they have the time and resources to job search effectively, to give them, job referrals to possibilities to get them back employed, may come at the cost of other elements of job quality if fathers are pressured by breadwinning norms to prioritize quickly finding a new job over maximizing job satisfaction or other job amenities. Pressure to accept any employment can mount, of course, when unemployment drags on. And indeed, Lane finds that male laid-off tech workers frame taking a lower status interim job as evidence of a manly commitment to providing for their families, whatever the personal cost. Damas, I might be mispronouncing her name, which is embarrassing because I know who she is. Sarah Damaske, realize I've never had the last name out loud or didn't stick in my head, finds that both middle class and working class unemployed women emphasize their commitment to returning to work, distancing themselves from stay-at-home mothers, although I should note, had very few mothers in her sample from this study that I'm quoting from. But motherhood can also provide an alternative source of status and meaning for unemployed women. And we see this in a variety of different qualitative studies by Stone, Norris, Rao, Sharon. Pregnancy in school-aged children, and we see in some quantitative work, also increases the risk of job loss, followed by non-employment for mothers of preschooler versus childless women. This is Luz's research from the US. Employer perceptions may also shape the consequences of job loss. So commitment, of course, is a key component of contemporary ideal worker norms, and experimental research shows evidence that mothers in the US, at least, are stereotyped as less committed. Likewise, opt-out periods on resumes result in lower commitment ratings and fewer callbacks for jobs. This is Weishauer's research. So therefore, we expect that mothers are at higher risk of having job loss interpreted potentially as evidence of commitment problems. While on the other hand, if employers are more sympathetic to fathers, this could offset any negative judgment. So again, overall, there's a variety of reasons to expect mothers would fare worse than others after job loss when it comes to employment outcomes, especially those with young children. Fathers may also suffer to the extent they also face caregiving constraints, but we expect this is likely outweighed by the positives associated with greater access to practical and network resources for job search, as well as employer sympathy. All right, so what do we see? So the bars here are looking at the probability, the net probability of re-employment. And I should note here that we also control, that when we're controlling for occupations, we're controlling for the characteristics of the job that they lost. Because obviously some folks don't have an occupation, they don't have one yet in the new job. So what we see here is that, and we have a smaller sample that we're looking at here. We're looking at about 1,425 people who lost their jobs, that we can then see what the probability of reemployment is. And what stands out, of course, is mothers of younger children in this light blue bar here. They have a significantly lower probability of being reemployed when we observe them again in the next year than any of the other groups. In fact, just to put the numbers on that, 18% of mothers with young children and 42 to 57% of people from other gender and parental groups find new jobs in the year after job loss. So there's quite a large difference there for the younger mothers. Fathers of older kids have the highest probability overall, and it's significantly higher than childless men. Fathers of younger children also had a higher probability of reemployment than childless men, but we don't see a significant difference there. So some evidence of better outcomes for fathers of older children, at least, and worse outcomes for mothers of young children. Okay, and this is just highlighting that fathers of older children versus childless men there. So the previous slide looked just at your likelihood of being not employed, but it didn't say why you weren't employed. So here we're making a distinction between, the the previous analysis, which is just you're not employed, and specifically being unemployed. So unemployed here is defined as not having a job and being actively looking for work. And what we see here is that we no longer, oops. Where are we going? Unemployment. We no longer see a significant difference between mothers of younger children and the other groups. So this tells us that what's driving that difference of younger mothers being not employed is not that they're more likely to be unemployed. It's not that they're searching for jobs and having a harder time finding jobs. It's that they're less likely to be looking for employment at all. So they're more likely to have withdrawn from the labor market in the year after job loss than the other groups are. So we see, on the other hand, that this advantage for fathers of older children does seem to be tied to less likely being unemployed. So an easier time finding new employment after job loss than childless men. All right. So a further question then is thinking about, well, why are mothers less likely to be employed? Why are they not in the labor market after job loss? And one question is whether this is more likely the case for them because they're less willing or able to accept jobs with worse working conditions, considering their caregiving responsibilities, whereas men with older children are perhaps more willing to do so because they have that pressure of being family breadwinners and they just want to get back in the labor market. So maybe they're paying a price for this faster reemployment by being employed in worse jobs. So the next analysis looks at that. And here what we're looking at is we're looking at workers' subjective ratings of their new job. So again, we have a smaller group of workers again, just looking at those who are reemployed and how they rate those new jobs on a number of different dimensions compared to the previous job that they had, the job that they lost. And we're just looking at, we've created a binary variable that's saying their probability of rating their new job is worse. So this is our overall job satisfaction rating. And we see that mothers of younger children are indeed less likely to rate their new job as worse. So they're less this suggests that they're less willing or able to take jobs that they're less satisfied with, perhaps in light of the alternative of staying at home with their kids for a period of time. And they are less so than most other groups, but not all other groups. Now, we don't see, however, that fathers of older children are sacrificing job satisfaction. They don't differ from anybody here. So that's not what's driving the difference for them. And here we just look at some other indicators. We look at the likelihood of rating overtime as worse. Now, it doesn't specify whether it's like availability of wanting more overtime or not having to work overtime. I think it's probably interpreted by most workers as like the possibility of overtime because that tends to pay better in Canada. Work hours, rating their work hours worse, rating family support programs worse, and rating flexibility. And here flexibility, the prompt for the question includes, the ability to vary your hours of work, the ability to work from home sometime, having a compressed work week, so various kinds of flexibility. So we do see that women with young children are also less likely than men and childless women to rate their new jobs as worse with respect to the availability of overtime and employer-provided family support programs, with the difference significant in all cases, save relative to mothers of older children. I should say that I don't think that we can think a whole lot about that difference in terms of overtime, because women with young kids are less likely to work overtime in general. And so in the new job or the old job, they're less likely to take jobs that require a lot of overtime. So that could be driving why they're not rating it as worse. It's just less of an issue for them one way or the other than for other workers. But however, we should note that the probability that women with young children rate work hours, which we would think would be really relevant in general, worse in their new job, reaches 24%, higher than fathers of older children and not significantly different from other groups. And they're they're as likely as all other groups to consider job flexibility worse in their new jobs. So this suggests that women with young children are not necessarily holding out for new jobs with family-friendly hours or flexibility. That's not driving why they have lower reemployment rates because they can't find those kinds of jobs. Men with older children are not, on the whole, more likely than other groups to experience degraded job quality in new jobs. The only case where men with older children stand out is with respect to work hours, but here they're actually much less likely than the other groups to rate their new job as worse. So overall, evidence does not suggest that men with older children experience lower unemployment after job loss because they're more willing to sacrifice job quality. And we didn't find any significant differences when we looked at wage differences in the old or new job. Okay, so takeaways. We find that parental status does correlate with a number of job loss dynamics, but it's not universally salient by any stretch. Consistent with Cha's American findings, we fail to find any evidence of maternal disadvantage in the risk of job loss in this data set. While employment discrimination rulings in Canada do, of course, reveal examples where women's real or presumptive caregiving obligations lead to unfair dismissal, it appears that such events are not common enough to impact national job loss figures. And furthermore, while flexibility stigma can harm mothers in the workplace, mothers' higher rates of part-time work do not correspond to increased risk of job loss, nor do differences in having flexible hours, working from home, or working less overtime. In other words, work arrangements that help mothers combine earning and caring don't seem to put them at higher risk of job loss, at least in terms of the national figures here. And this may reflect the normalization, perhaps, of work-family accommodations among mothers, possibly making them less salient to employers as indicators of commitment. We do find that fathers of young children are less likely to lose their jobs than similar childless men, reinforcing breadwinner norms. And notably, this is only true where employers have some discretion. So we cannot directly test for discrimination, but the findings are broadly consistent. I didn't mention this when I looked at just the cases where the employers didn't have discretion. We don't see any differences. So the findings are broadly consistent with the expectation that employers might favor fathers of young children to support their breadwinner roles. Now, the persistence of gendered breadwinner and caregiver norms is also seen in the consequence of job loss, where mothers are not at higher risk of losing their job loss, but mothers of young children in particular are least likely to be reemployed a year later, which is a product of higher rates of labor force withdrawal rather than unemployment. So we do expect that this reflects to some degree the sort of higher salience or sort of socially acceptable possibility of staying home with their children rather than searching for new jobs in light of the various constraints that they face around caregiving and of course the demoralizing effect of job loss as well. Now, we have to caution, of course, against an overly sunny interpretation of the outcomes for mothers of young children who appear to have maybe chosen to stay home here. We note that Damask's qualitative study found that some mothers who left their jobs felt pressured by their partners to stay home, for example. And in Canada, childcare, as I mentioned, is very costly and can be difficult to find, which may also create barriers to job search, especially for low-income mothers. And we also look at a relatively short period of time here. And again, some of the qualitative research by Rao suggests that while in the sort of initial time period after job loss, where some mothers sort of took some pleasure in having more time with their kids being home, tended to wear after a while. They tended to chafe at the restrictions and wanted to get back in the labor force. So it might be that a longer time horizon we would see something different here. All right, so I want to move on now and just talk very quickly about some of the things that we found when we looked at job loss in the context of the pandemic, particularly. As I mentioned, the pandemic, of course, has caused widespread social and economic disruption everywhere, including in Canada. And this led to high rates of job loss, especially in that first wave when everything shut down in early March for a period of time. Non-essential businesses were closed across the country, government agencies were closed, those who could work from home were encouraged to do so, and parents scrambled as schools and childcare centers also, for the most part, closed across the country. Now, there is some variation in pandemic responses and the policy responses across the country because employment, health and education all fall under provincial jurisdiction in Canada largely. So there were some variation responses, but the broad parameters were really similar. So for example, only Quebec elementary schools completely reopened before the end of the school year in June. As the pandemic kind of wore on a little bit and the first wave abated, restrictions eased in early May to early June. Childcare centers were allowed to reopen with full capacity for the most part around the country, although with some, extra rules around cohort models to keep kids from mixing too much with as many different children, cleaning procedures and so forth. But financial pressures caused by these new procedures and reduced enrollment prevented many from reopening in Canada. Summer programs for school-aged children that are a really important way that parents have care for their younger children in the summer also face a lot of restrictions and limited capacity. So pandemic restrictions, for example, stopped all overnight camps, which were quite a common thing in Canada over the summertime. Some day programs were offered, but many couldn't operate with the required restrictions and closed or moved online. So there was sort of limited care availability again for school-age kids over the summer. Now, in the fall, across the country, schools reopened for younger elementary school children full-time. But they didn't have full provisions for, ventilation, physical distancing, all those things. So parents of more vulnerable children often kept their kids home, or those who are particularly concerned about the pandemic, at least for some period of time. And of course, there was, basically some parents choosing or being forced to choose distance learning in that circumstance. So as the economy recovered, parents didn't always have access to the care arrangements that were necessary to return to work. When asked in early June about their concerns about returning to your physical workplace now, 35% of Canadian fathers with children under 18 and 56% of mothers reported childcare or caregiving issues. So the government did enact some various policy measures in recognition of this, basically financial supports for folks who had kids who were not in school or were not able to access care. There's sort of two different programs over the course of the pandemic that were implemented, and really the focus here was on paying parents so that they would be able to stay home and provide for their children. That was the form of the support that was given, and there was nothing in the policy to sort of incentivize any kind of equal sharing of that. As you probably know, when that happens, mothers who tend to take on that role. Employment standards to protect caregivers' ability to return to their jobs also varied quite a bit across the country. So in BC, for example, where I live, you could take leave as long as needed for reasons including a school, daycare, or similar facility closure. But the federal jurisdiction, which covers folks working in industries that cross provincial boundaries and federal government employees, restricted leaves to 26 weeks. And Quebec just relied on an existing 10-day personal leave provision. So there's quite a lot of variability in the kind of employment protection for those who had lost their caregiving supports during the pandemic. And of course, while fathers did increase their caregiving and their housework in the pandemic, so did mothers. And mothers were disproportionately responsible for caregiving in the pandemic and for homeschooling. So given this context, we expected that even though we didn't find a motherhood penalty for job loss in our pre-pandemic analysis, that we might see a difference here when we look at what's happening over the course of the pandemic. So to look at this, we look at data from the Labor Force Survey in Canada. It's a monthly survey. It's about 50,000 people per month, although the response rates were lower in the pandemic. They're coming back up again. And we looked at the data basically from February, just before the pandemic hit, through, I'll show you the latest data up to January here, or sorry, up to the end of December. So basically over sort of 2020. And it's a nationally representative data set. So again, we're looking at job loss. We look just at those who are sort of still employed, and then we also do a further analysis that I was really just doing the last few days, just for the fun of it, for this talk, looking at sort of discretionary job loss. So again, those sort of layoffs that aren't due to an employer closing and firings. Although of course, I think that this means something quite different in the pandemic context than it does in the pre-pandemic. It's not necessarily the case. Whether employers are really sort of distinguishing between some workers or not, or more likely to be just kind of, closing down for a period, I think it's a little bit hard to say. Again, we look at parents, although we focus here on those who have children under 12. So they're really too young to be left alone by themselves. Again, distinguishing the youngest kids between them and having a binary measure for gender and a bunch of different control variables, as much as we can control for basically experience, tenure, education, age, marital status, race, ethnicity, immigrant, occupation, unionized, and industry. All right, so this is the main finding. This is from an article that's coming out this week in Gender and Society, which is looking at the pattern of who is still employed, comparing men and women by parental status over the course of the pandemic. And you'll note here that, you know, even prior to the pandemic, and this is we're restricting our analysis to folks who had been sort of employed in the previous years. So folks, they might not be employed in that first month that we see them, but they were attached to the labor market for the most part. They were employed in the previous year, and we see that parents in general had higher employment rates throughout here. Now, what we notice, of course, is that for non-parents, although women had a higher employment rate prior to the pandemic, this converges over the pandemic. So this is some evidence of gender disadvantage, of the women being, you know, losing that advantage where they had somewhat higher employment rates, but very much tracks what's happening through that course of the pandemic in terms of the likelihood of being employed, whether you do or don't have kids. For parents, however, we see this widening. So particularly if we look at the youngest kids, parents with the youngest kid, as soon as the pandemic starts hitting in March, mothers are hit harder than fathers are. Sort of converges a bit in April as the men lost their jobs a little bit later, but then through the spring and summer, we have a widening gap between mothers and fathers of young children. Once schools start to open, it does sort of narrow a little bit more, but still, even by December, there's a gap there. And for those who have a youngest child in school, the gap actually gets even wider as those schools closed, and persists only to really start narrowing again dramatically once schools are back in session. Now, I'm not going to break this down by education just because I don't want to talk at you forever here. I want to wrap this up. But I should note that these patterns are more pronounced for women with less education. That's really what's driving this here. There's less of a difference for women with university education, for example. Now, and I think I'll just probably stop after this one. I do have a couple other slides, but this is sort of the main one, so we have some time for discussion and questions. So this is sort of looking at the flip side. This is looking at what people report is the reason for not being employed. And we're restricting the analysis here just to those who lost their jobs in the pandemic. So note that we start at March. So these are all pandemic months here. The red and the blue lines are folks who report the kinds of job endings we reported as more likely involving some potential for employer discretion, layoffs that aren't a result of firms totally closing or moving, and discharges. And of course, in the pandemic context, as I said, it's less clear like how much discretion there really is. I'm not sure I would call these discretionary job losses in the context of a pandemic, right? The blue and the gray, the gray and the black lines report those who lost their jobs. They say they quit their jobs, they left their jobs for family-related reasons. And this would usually be classified as sort of a voluntary quit. But of course, in the pandemic context with limited childcare, this is more like being pushed out than opting out, right? Now, note that I should say that in any given month, new job endings reported as family quits are super rare over the course of the pandemic. The numbers, therefore, are really reflecting people who are initially not employed for other reasons, like they were laid off, but who come to report this as a family quit. So basically, their employer lays them off. At some point, their employer wants them to come back, and they're not able to come back, so they say that they're not working for family-related reasons. There's almost nobody who's reporting that like, oh, I left my job for the first time for family-related reasons. So when we look at, again, we sort of see there's not a lot of difference here for the folks without children. when we look at these like youngest child numbers, we see that what's driving that difference in employment rate is the widening over the summer is partly a growing difference in those who are laid off, but also a creeping up of those who are now reporting that they're not employed for family reasons. So this is sort of this, you know, moving from the one status of being laid off to being losing, you know, probably more likely to have lost that connection with your employer altogether. You're not able to come back anymore at that point. So that I think is quite concerning that we see that. But there's still, it's still less, right? It's still more people who are saying that they were laid off than that it's a family, specifically a family related reason at that point. And for those with older children, it's really the layoff, the difference in the layoff rate and the not being able to get back to work after layoffs that is driving that difference. The family-related quits are not proving to be as important, probably because as they start to creep up a little bit over the summer, but as the schools reopen, the mothers are more likely to be able to come back to work and probably to be able to assure their employers that when schools are reopening, they will be able to come back. So that I think makes a difference as well there. All right. And this is just showing that if we just look at the monthly risk of layoffs, that the monthly risk is really so much bigger at the very beginning of the pandemic. And it's the people who are laid off and then still not able to get back to work that's driving those big numbers rather than ongoing layoffs per se, although we see some up and downs as the pandemic goes. All right. So just to sort of round off here, so the good news is that gender employment gaps among parents did narrow with the loosening of restrictions, the increased availability of childcare options, and especially the reopening of schools. So while the pandemic was a shock, it didn't, you know, totally undermine women's employment for all time. When those things loosened, mothers' employment did start to converge again with fathers. But at the same time, there's of course areas of concern, particularly I think those mothers of younger children, where you're seeing that transition to reporting that they're not employed for reasons of family reasons. And I think that the sort of the long-term viability of the childcare system is really an important issue, and it's something that the government is, you know, now has a task force to be. They've just started a task force announced yesterday for, you know, women's recovery from the pandemic that has a lot of childcare people on it. So I think that that's, you know, somewhat promising as well. And again, I didn't really show the numbers in detail, but I also think it's really worth emphasizing here that the impact was much stronger for mothers of younger children, less educated mothers in the pandemic. They were the ones who are really hit the most. So there's an important intersectionality there between class, the kinds of jobs people had, and what happened to them in the pandemic. And we know that there's also racial differences, although with the publicly available data, I wasn't able to really look into that.